Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Cyclone Chasers update, the 10th of January 2013. A lot to get through tonight, just like last night, so let's get into it. Severe tropical cyclone Narelle. This was issued about 5 p.m. today, Queensland time, and we see here Category 3 system, small range of its extremely destructive winds, but overall fairly large gale radius and expected to push towards the southwest or south-southwest and get very close to the coast. Now you can see here the grey error margin. Now if the cyclone tracks a little bit to the right of that track, it's likely to get very, very close to the coast here between Onslow, Exmouth, maybe even after crossing the northwest coast, the northwest cape there, around Coral Bay or further down towards Carnarvon, if it does start to recurve. But still a fairly large error margin over 48 hours, and there are still models that are showing it hitting the coast, so we do need to pay very close attention to them. There's very little margin for error here because the difference between, life-threatening and extremely destructive winds to just gales with damaging wind gusts, is only 20 or 30 kilometres. We chased Tropical Cyclone Lure, for instance, last year. We were about 20 kilometres from the centre, and the difference was about almost 100 kilometre an hour in wind speed in that 20 kilometres that we missed it by. So it's going to be very, very tight. If it follows this track, and let's hope it does for the residents that live in this area, if it follows this track, the only thing you're really going to see is gales. You might see some damaging, maybe even destructive winds on the just near Exmouth, and there is the probability there for that happening. Still fairly low, about 20% chance of seeing those destructive winds around Exmouth. But it is there, and remember those probabilities will skyrocket if the system takes a more southerly option and pushes to the right. If the system takes a more westerly option and pushes to the left, well, most of this area will still experience either gale force or very near gale force winds. Will still experience fairly heavy rainfall as well right along this coastline. The latest update from the JTWC, the Joint Typhoon Warning Centre, still has the system maintaining a trajectory just to the west of the mainland. And they do stress, though, that after 48 hours, and 48 hours on this chart is this point here, there is a huge variability in the model guidance. Some models then plough it straight towards the south and whack it into the northwest coast. Some other models start the variability at 36 hours and push it south from here. So you can see that there's a very large variability here after about 36 hours. The track forecast after that, very low confidence. We really don't know what it's going to do. What we're more interested in is this next 48 hours, because this next 48 hours becomes key as to whether the northwest coast needs to brace for a big impact or whether they'll just cop a bit of gale and a lot of rain. We'll go through some of the individual models now. The only ensemble modelling that we have out at the moment is the Global Forecasting System, the GFS model, and the GFS model is very, very confident on this track forecast, and that leads the JTWC to be very confident on their track forecast. This model is a lot more confident in this track forecast than the European model is in its, and then that any other model is in their forecast as well. So has it pushing towards the south-southwest, a little bit more southwesterly here before drifting south and eventually coming in towards the mainland part of WA as a much weaker system later on in the forecast period. But that's still, as I say, a lot of variability and a lot of doubt in that at the moment. So look, at this stage, very tight agreement here in the model members between now and 72 hours, just off the coast. It is very tough, very tight to call, though, and certainly not, I would not be telling anyone Karratha West to be resting on this system yet. Now, there's still too much variability. I know this model doesn't show it, but I'll show you some other models. There's too much variability in them for you to take this one easily and just think it's going to miss you to the west. That's what it's most likely to do still, but because it's so intense, it's such a strong system, it's also a pretty large system, it doesn't have to hit the coast, particularly for this Exmouth to Onslow region, it doesn't have to hit the coast for you to cop some fairly strong, possibly damaging or even destructive wind gusts. Just before I show you those, if we just have a look at the latest that we've got in the visible imagery, the last one for the day, we can just see some really tall thunderstorms developing here on the outer edge of the eye, or what looks to be an eye type feature forming in this system. But look at these tall thunderstorms just on the edge there. So this thing's got a fair bit of intensifying left to go in it yet. So it's certainly not done yet. Alright, now let's take a look at those models. And we can see here through 4 different model plots here, the GFS, the CMC, the UK Met, and the NOGAPS model. We can see the variance in them. So they're all pushing this slowly to the southwest, except for the CMC, which has continued to suggest a smashing of the system around Karratha to Onslow. And it just very, very stubborn, this model. It just continues to maintain that sort of crossing point. The other 3, however, have now started to push the system out just to the west of the coastline. But you see here, the NOGAPS model pushes it back onto shore. The UK Met pushes it on shore just here around Coral Bay, just south of Coral Bay. This is a fairly troublesome forecast, because if that does happen, you know, as the further south we go, and the system won't weaken all that much between 20 and 22 south. It will start a weakening trend, but it's not going to weaken all that much before landfall, if landfall does tend to occur there. And as we head further south, the structures are not built to withstand the sort of intensity of winds that the structures in, say, places like Exmouth or Karratha or Port Hedland are built on. So the further south it goes, and if it maintains intensity, that becomes a really troublesome forecast. So hopefully it will do what the GFS and the Europeans suggest it'll do, which is hang offshore for a while, weaken out as water temperatures start to ease off, before eventually either recurving or dying. Speaking of the Euro, it's not on there, so let's have a look at what the Euro's doing with it. Okay, so this is the Euro. Now, the Euro doesn't allow us to show you its model plots of its tropical cyclones, unfortunately, so we can't actually show you little diagrams like we just showed you with all the others, but the Euro will allow us to show you the ensemble. And so the ensemble shows us that the cyclone should be located well to the north or north-northwest of Exmouth by tomorrow morning. By Saturday morning, the Euro shows us that we're going to see this tropical cyclone out just to the northwest of the Exmouth area, and the Euro is also very, very tight agreement, just like the GFS model on this track, out to 48 hours. So very tight agreement that it's going to just miss the west coast. So that's something we do need to pay attention to, the Euro being in such tight agreement at the 2-day mark. At the 3-day mark, things start to change a little. So you can see by day 3 this area of yellow. Now the yellow shows us a little bit more doubt in the modelling, and we can see that while the favoured thing is for the system to be well offshore, off the west coast, probably west of Coral Bay, there are some suggestions that it could be very, very close to the coast on day 3 as it makes its approach a little closer, or it does its recurve a little bit sharper and pushes onto the coast, or just grazes the coast out here towards Coral Bay, Carnarvon, that region there. The other thing the model members start to do, though, is they do start to weaken the system a little bit at this point in time. Now, bear in mind that if one model has it completely weak and one model has it strong, the resultant total, or the resultant strength of the system, will be underrepresented in an ensemble. So we do need to bear that in mind. But overall, just a slight weakening trend there on Sunday. And here's where things just go completely skewed, people, because on Monday we have completely varying estimates as to where this thing could be. So unlike the GFS, where everything was in tight agreement of a recurve back towards WA, this model is a lot less decided. So it's pushing it as far south as Perth, and as far northwest, you know, out here in the southeast Indian Ocean. So there's no real coming together of the modelling in the longer term. But for the first or the next couple of days, we can see that the models are very, very clear, at least GFS and the Euro, very clear on pushing this system just to the west of the mainland. And we're starting to see the same from the UK Met, but the UK Met just like some of the Euro members, do have it hitting the coast a little bit further to the south. Now, if it does that, it's still going to be a significant tropical cyclone, so it's not a laughing matter if it does hit a little bit further to the south. It probably won't be as intense as it will be up here if it makes a direct contact on Exmouth, but it is still not going to be, and it's not going to be a little Cat 1 thing if it's just hanging off the coast here or just hits the coast here around Coral Bay or Carnarvon. So it's still going to be a significant tropical cyclone there. All right. Our shift and focus now will turn towards the north. By the way, the Coral Sea is now no longer really expected to fire. There's nothing really happening there at the moment. That low is there, no doubt about it, but it's not really doing much, and it's not expected to do too much. We're going to leave Tropical Cyclone Narelle there, because after that it just becomes silly when we start looking at the next day, because we got a bunch of models that have it down here near Perth. We've got another bunch of models out here. It just becomes silly to look that far ahead in something that's got this much doubt in it at 4 days' time. What we do have a lot more, or a lot less doubt in, is a tropical low forming out here near the Northern Territory coastline, and that could be the catalyst of the next monsoon trough. Now, that's going to happen either late on the weekend or early next week, and this will need to be watched because it is likely to travel in a very similar pattern to Narelle. It's also likely to be in a fairly reasonable chance of development because it's in a reasonably good environment up there with high pressure ridging in the upper levels all through Central Australia. It means it's got light winds in the upper levels. It's got very little wind shear. The only problem might be moisture, but even then it's got a nice monsoon trough feeding into it. So with any luck, as we've been saying now for a few days, this low will be the catalyst for the Northern Territory's monsoon come this weekend, early next week. That's what we're hoping for. Now, let's track this low as it further develops over the next 3 to 5 days after Monday. So by Tuesday, we still have this rather weakish low pressure area out here well to the west of the Northern Territory. But we see it's completely disorganised. There's not much really to it. Let's compare that with what the GFS is showing us. By Tuesday, the GFS has already spun us up a nice little cyclone. Remember that the GFS always overestimates tropical cyclone formation probabilities, so do take that with a grain of salt. But the fact that they're both showing a low pressure area in this exact area is something that we do need to pay attention to, and it does show some sort of ensemble, at least some sort of ensemble agreement. By Wednesday next week, we see the Euro forming that tropical low a little stronger now, and it does start to define it well west of the Kimberley coastline. Certainly looks like a tropical low there on that chart. And if we compare that to the GFS again, we see once again, as I say, the GFS does tend to overdo things, but the GFS probably has a Category 2 tropical cyclone off the coast of the Pilbara, a little bit further to the south, or a lot further to the southeast than the European had it. And pushing southwest. The UK Met, not really interested in it, but it does also show this really broad area of low pressure at that same time around Wednesday. Same thing as no gaps at the same time around next Wednesday. Does have this really broad area of lower pressure here off the Kimberley coastline. And the CMC, as it tends to do, just like the GFS, is very aggressive and develops a Category 2 tropical cyclone and whacks into the North Kimberley coast already by Wednesday. So you can see that there's reasonable agreement this far out at 6 or 7 days' time to suggest that we're going to see a secondary circulation forming out here anywhere near the top end coast, pushing west and then continuing to push west or southwest. Exactly whether it's going to affect land or not, it is far too early for us to tell. Most of the thinking at the moment is it's going to come under very similar steering pattern to Narelle, in which it'll push towards the southwest or west southwest. It'll further develop and then push again to the southwest or south southwest. Very similar steering. Look, the steering pattern over the entire part of Australia is going to be very stagnant over the next couple, or well, at least probably for the next week. We're going to see this big high pressure ridge in the middle levels. It's not going to do anything. It's just going to sit there and sit there and sit there and create this really nice spawning ground in the northern parts of Australia along with the monsoon trough. for tropical low or tropical cyclone development. Unfortunately, at this stage, nothing happening for the Coral Sea, nothing happening for the Gulf yet, but in the longer term, the Gulf does look like it will fire, particularly this southern Gulf to the eastern Gulf area. It looks like it may fire in the long term. So once again, I'm just fast forward from Wednesday to Saturday for you, and now looking at an ensemble, because it's pointless looking at the deterministic this far out. But the ensemble definitely shows a potential tropical cyclone here to the north of the Kimberley next Saturday. Very similar location to where Narelle is. It basically does a very similar trajectory or path to Narelle. And once again, whether it hits land or not, we're not sure. There is a fairly good agreement that there will be a tropical low here. Once again, we just don't know whether it'll form into a cyclone. It looks, once again, that because of that steering flow, lack of wind shear, the monsoon trough firing, everything looks set to go again. But you never know with tropical cyclones. They're like elite athletes. Everything's got to be 100% right for them to perform. And same thing with the TC. It's the elite athlete of the meteorological world. So it needs to have everything 100% if it's going to fire. And we can't tell this far out if it's going to have that. And then Sunday, if we look one more day ahead, and as I say, we just do this just for the benefit of a heads up in case something happens, but we also ask you not to take it too seriously. We do see a tropical cyclone approaching the coast between somewhere, sort of headland all the way to Exmouth, somewhere in there. We're seeing a tropical or another tropical cyclone. So, look, the models are pretty consistent on this. They are showing a low. They are showing that low moving west and then south. That's pretty consistent from most of them. As I say, whether it becomes a cyclone, whether it hits the coast, way too early to tell. And you can see the 10-day GFS ensemble. This is the ensemble. I'd never show you the normal run because it is plagued with errors. But this is the ensemble of the GFS, so 24 GFS members. Same thing, tropical cyclone near the coast, tropical cyclone just offshore. It's confused, doesn't know. And also tropical low forming in the southern Gulf. And that's another thing we'll need to watch as we head out towards the end part of January. And then obviously the Coral Sea as we head into the last few days of January. But this is our next area of focus, is the top end coast after Narelle pushes through. As I say, west to west-southwest, then a more southerly track is the more likely scenario at this stage. A lot of model disagreement this far out though. So if you're on the Pilbara coastline and you haven't prepared for Narelle, please make sure that you do your preparations of your cyclone kit. We say it over and over again, but it needs to be done just in case this next one does decide to push a little bit further to the south, a little bit faster. And as I say, then we start watching the Gulf. After this next WA system, we start watching the Gulf of Carpentaria for potential formation there in the longer term. And after that, we start to look at the Coral Sea for something happening either around the Solomons or even Fiji. And we just don't know that far ahead then. Alright folks, thanks for watching tonight. I'm camping for the next few nights, so most of the updates will be handled by our admin team on Facebook, but I will try and make sure that our videos are up over the next couple of nights regardless. Thanks again for watching, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow night.